Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today, I'm revisiting Intel's XeSS upscaling technology to see how things have improved with the latest versions, specifically version 1.2 that we're starting to see across a handful of games. I was pretty unimpressed with the original version of XeSS that debuted a year ago, finding that it looked worse and delivered lower performance than even AMD's FSR 2 technology when run on non-Intel GPUs. This made it difficult to recommend using and a bit pointless for game developers to integrate. So hopefully the latest 1.2 update brings about significant improvements. Intel's XeSS is one of the more complex upscaling solutions we have today, as it actually includes multiple versions depending on the GPU hardware it's being run on. The best version is the XMX version, which is exclusive to Intel's Arc GPUs. I was actually quite impressed with this version. The AI model being used and accelerated on Arc allowed it to deliver a similar experience to Nvidia's DLSS. The main drawback here being that Intel only coded it for Arc's AI accelerators. There's no port of this code to Nvidia Tensor Cores, for example, so there's a very limited range of GPUs that have access to this version. Most other GPU owners get access to the DP4A version of XeSS, so while this upscaler does have broad platform support, the version that runs on most other hardware is significantly downgraded, or at least that was the case with the initial 1.0 release. Intel says this is because the DP4A version runs a simpler upscaling model, allowing it to run on hardware with less AI acceleration capabilities. And it's this DP4A version that will be the focus of today's video, as Intel specifically claimed to have improved this version with the latest XeSS 1.1 and 1.2 updates. The changelog for XeSS reveals version 1.1 introduced an updated model with improved temporal stability, while 1.2 brought further performance optimizations. What I'm specifically interested in is whether XeSS is now worth using on AMD Radeon GPUs that only have access to FSR upscaling, and how close it gets to DLSS on Nvidia GPUs. But before we take a look at image quality, we first have to figure out which quality modes to use for each test, matching them up based on performance. So let's take a look across the 6 games we're assessing in this video, all tested on our AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D test system with 32GB of DDR5 memory. First up is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, tested on an AMD Radeon RX 7800XT at 4K using the maximum settings. Here we find that XeSS 1.2 is a step down in performance relative to FSR 2.1 at all quality levels. So for example, XeSS quality runs notably slower than FSR quality, with XeSS balanced being the more appropriate comparison to FSR quality in terms of output FPS. Similarly, XeSS performance matches up with FSR balanced. In fact, FSR here is 6% faster comparing those configurations. FSR's performance mode then provides the biggest performance uplift, with no XeSS mode offering that level of uplift. It's a little different on the Nvidia GeForce RTX 4070. XeSS still runs somewhat slower than FSR 2, but it's a much closer match. FSR is just 4% faster comparing quality versus quality, though it is 7% faster comparing the balanced modes and 10% faster comparing the performance modes, so as the render resolution decreases, FSR takes a further advantage. However, in this title, on the RTX 4070, DLSS is faster across the board, offering an additional 3 to 6% performance uplift. This means that DLSS quality, for example, offers around the same performance as XeSS balanced. In Spider-Man Miles Morales, there's a smaller gap between XeSS and FSR performance on the RX 7800XT. XeSS is still the harder feature to run, with FSR offering a 6% performance advantage comparing the quality modes, but this is half the margin seen in Call of Duty. However, it still means the closest match in performance is the step down in quality mode from XeSS, so XeSS balanced versus FSR quality, and XeSS performance versus FSR balanced. Meanwhile, on the RTX 4070, XeSS and FSR are a very close performance match across the available quality presets. Here, XeSS quality is actually slightly faster than FSR quality, with similar performance seen with the balanced presets. DLSS ends up slightly faster again, especially for the balanced mode, though it's much more even than in Modern Warfare 3. In Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, we're seeing the use of XeSS 1.2, FSR 2.2, and DLSS 3.5 upscaling. On the RX 7800XT, this leads to pretty similar performance between the XeSS and FSR quality modes, with a similar level of performance also seen using balanced. However, the FSR performance mode is notably faster than the equivalent XeSS mode, so FSR still has that lower render resolution advantage when it comes to performance in this game. On the RTX 4070, FSR and XeSS perform roughly the same, so we can match up the quality offerings nicely. DLSS quality is a little faster in this title, but the other DLSS presets also match up in performance. Realistically, neither of these upper mid-range GPUs are quite fast enough to run Rift apart at 4K using the highest quality settings, so upscaling becomes essential for the experience. Ghostrunner 2 is an interesting example because it's the only one of the 6 titles evaluated that uses FSR 2.0 instead of a newer version of FSR. Also included is DLSS 3.1.30 and XeSS 1.2. Despite this, on the RX 7800 XT, FSR has a performance advantage, with FSR quality offering 9% more performance than XeSS quality. The closest match in FPS then becomes FSR quality up against XeSS balanced, and FSR balanced up against XeSS performance, so similar to what we saw in Modern Warfare 3. On the RTX 4070, I saw the quality modes for FSR and XeSS deliver roughly the same performance, although this diverged at lower render resolutions, with FSR offering more performance. XeSS balanced ended up between FSR balanced and quality, for example. In this title, DLSS runs faster than either alternative upscaling technology, with an 8% performance lead using the quality mode, rather significant for upscalers and a greater margin than we'd see between these two on higher-end GPUs. The Talos Principle 2 is a fully up-to-date game that uses the latest tech from all 3 companies, DLSS 3.5.10, FSR 2.2, and XeSS 1.2. On the RX 7800 XT, FSR quality had a 7% performance advantage over XeSS quality, with the XeSS balanced mode sitting between FSR quality and balanced in performance. The XeSS performance mode was then the best match for FSR balanced, so this is another title on Radeon hardware where XeSS is a little more difficult to run relative to FSR. When we move over to the RTX 4070, all 3 upscaling solutions deliver roughly the same level of performance when comparing each of the respective quality modes. DLSS is slightly faster than FSR, which is slightly faster than XeSS, so you could almost tune performance to the exact FPS number you want if the visual quality wasn't different between the modes. And the final game we're looking at is Assassin's Creed Mirage, quite a significant outlier compared to the previous titles. In this game, on the RX 7800 XT, FSR is significantly faster, with the XeSS performance mode only matching FSR quality, a huge render resolution discrepancy. Comparing quality versus quality, FSR runs 19% faster, and it's unclear what the cause would be. Is it FSR running much faster than usual, or XeSS running much slower than usual? I think I'm leaning towards the latter. On an RTX 4070, FSR also has a performance advantage relative to XeSS, but this time it's less pronounced. Here, XeSS balanced is matching up with FSR quality, and XeSS performance matching up with FSR balanced. Typically on Nvidia GPUs, we have seen much closer scaling between FSR and XeSS, so this game is still an outlier on Nvidia hardware, but the GeForce GPU architecture just seems to be that little bit better at running XeSS relative to Radeon. These performance findings are great for pairing up various quality settings and quite interesting overall. When testing the initial release of XeSS, it ran pretty terribly on the mid-range RX 6650 XT we looked at, with XeSS performance being the usual match for FSR quality. Today, testing on a newer generation of AMD hardware and with Intel's claimed XeSS performance optimizations, there is still a performance gap between XeSS and FSR at the same render resolution, but now XeSS balanced is more usually matching up on FSR quality, so that's a better position to be in. Similarly, on Nvidia GPUs, previously we'd found that XeSS balanced was the closest match for DLSS quality and FSR quality. Across these 6 XeSS 1.2 titles, we are seeing more occasions where XeSS quality is the correct matchup, although usually it's still a little slower than the other options. This should lead to more favourable image quality comparisons than what we saw initially. Now let's take a look at image quality, starting with the Modern Warfare 3 benchmark. I'm pitting XeSS balanced up against FSR quality, the closest performance match on AMD hardware, in addition to DLSS quality. Throughout this relatively fast-paced pass, there is no doubting that DLSS provides the best image quality, DLSS has the least amount of artifacts in motion, the best fine detail reconstruction, and the most stable image, so that's the preferred way to play. Between XeSS and FSR, it's much closer, even with the render resolution disadvantage for XeSS. Generally, I found XeSS to better handle fine details, such as wires and foliage during this section of the benchmark, although FSR was a little more stable. With any sort of fast motion, I also thought XeSS delivered a higher resolution output, so for example when the gun is swinging wildly across the screen, the XeSS image is more detailed and less noisy. It was pretty hard to see either of these differences in real time though. Typically the image quality between these XeSS and FSR configurations was pretty similar. When we bump XeSS up to using the quality mode, it now has a clear image quality advantage over FSR in my opinion, with all of the elements just spoken about being enhanced. So even better fine detail reconstruction and a more stable presentation. I don't think the DP4A model is as good as DLSS in this scenario, but to my eyes it gets closer than FSR using the quality mode. Let's move now to Spider-Man Miles Morales to take a look at stationary image quality, so when the character isn't moving. All three upscaling technologies have issues in this shot. FSR and XeSS with the building on the left, and the artifacting is worse with XeSS than FSR. DLSS has issues with the moving LED sign in the upper left. To me, the XeSS issues are the most distracting. It just doesn't handle this oblique pattern very well. I should also point out that it was very difficult to match sharpness between these upscalers, so typically the FSR image was the most sharp, at times too sharp, but this isn't the focus of the comparison. Outside of those main stability issues, I think DLSS has the most stable image, followed by XeSS, followed by FSR. There's a few small amounts of shimmering for FSR that's more stable with XeSS. When we bump XeSS up to the quality mode, now comparing the same render resolution, I think XeSS has a clear advantage again over FSR, with less artifacting on that problematic building, although this is only a performance match on Nvidia hardware. Also worth exploring is XeSS performance up against the bounce modes for the other two. I was actually reasonably impressed with the stability of the performance mode, and honestly I think it has fewer issues than the FSR bounced mode. It's not perfect, obviously that building still has issues, but fine details shimmer less when using XeSS performance. Next up we have the opening scene of the game, which has a lot of close-up hair detail, and with these configurations I would have DLSS ahead of FSR ahead of XeSS, with the requirement to use bounced XeSS to get similar performance hurting the presentation a bit here. However, just a few moments later, XeSS has less noticeable moire patterns in Miles' sweater, even outperforming DLSS in my opinion. In some of the later shots with background tree branches, I felt that XeSS offered less image stability but better reconstruction in motion, but other aspects to the FSR image were less stable than XeSS, so it trades blows depending on the scene and element. XeSS isn't too bad here and is usable, but doesn't do enough to be clearly superior to FSR when it has to be run at a lower render resolution. Certainly better than what I experienced testing XeSS 1.0 in Spider-Man a year ago. Here's some in-game motion which isn't synchronized perfectly but shows the difference when swinging around the city. This is the worst showing for XeSS yet, with the bounced mode clearly producing a less stable image in motion even relative to FSR, which itself is less stable than DLSS. The AI accelerated model of XeSS just can't outperform the higher render resolution of FSR when looking at some of the foliage elements in motion. With that said, XeSS using the quality mode gets much closer to what we see from FSR, so if XeSS was a bit faster on AMD cards, it might be a viable solution in this title, otherwise I'd use FSR instead. Next up is Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, and this is a game where the quality modes for all three upscalers delivered similar performance. In this stationary scene, we see a classic area where FSR doesn't perform very well, and that's on a semi-transparent object. Pay close attention to the flag on the lamp pole as the purple pulse moves through the scene. As the flag moves, FSR image quality falls apart, whereas XeSS and DLSS look relatively decent. Even with this FSR 2.2 implementation, AMD's solution continues to struggle with these sorts of elements. Throughout my time playing the opening sections of the game, I just wasn't very impressed with the FSR image quality outside of its good level of sharpness with sharpness tuning ability. FSR has lots of stability issues with fine details in motion. There's a lot more artifacting around Ratchet as he runs around, small edge details and grates shimmer significantly more with FSR relative to XeSS, while XeSS has stability that's much better, though not quite at the level of DLSS. Most, if not all, of the fast action scenes look superior with XeSS, and that's how I'd choose to play the game. Those shimmering artifacts with FSR are just too distracting to use, and with good performance from XeSS, I think it's the obvious choice in this game. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Ghostrunner 2 because it's obvious from quite early on that FSR 2.0 is no match for XeSS 1.2 and DLSS. I'm not sure why such a recent title would integrate an old version of FSR, but it just doesn't hold up well in this game at all, even with a performance advantage on AMD GPUs. XeSS has some notable stability issues at times, especially relative to DLSS, and this is partly due to the comparison here between balanced and quality, but FSR does not have good image stability at all. Grates and fine mesh detail look pretty terrible in this game even when using FSR quality, with XeSS doing a much better job of reconstructing those details. When we swap out XeSS balanced for quality, the advantage between XeSS and FSR extends even further, showing that XeSS is the much better solution relative to FSR 2.0 when upscaling from the same render resolution. In the Talos Principle 2, we get a good look at an Unreal Engine 5 game using the latest versions of DLSS, FSR, and XeSS. The first thing that stood out to me when comparing each of the upscalers was foliage quality. This is a highly detailed game in some areas, and for elements like foliage, FSR shows quite a bit of artifacting even when we compare the quality mode at 4K to the balanced mode of XeSS, which delivers similar performance. Foliage has been an issue for FSR in other titles, and while this isn't one of the worst examples, the FSR presentation is grainier and has more shimmering compared to DLSS or XeSS, which appear more stable. On even closer inspection, the DLSS image is a higher apparent resolution and preserves more fine detail as we move from left to right. That's not to say the XeSS image is always better. The closer foliage elements look superior with Intel's upscaler, but the palm tree in the sky is less stable and shows quite a bit of artifacting in motion. In this scene, the most immediately obvious difference was the gate element, which showed more artifacting in motion on the XeSS balanced side compared to FSR quality and DLSS quality. While the XeSS image has superior foliage quality and disocclusion artifacts, the grate doesn't look very good, and I also found it tricky to match sharpness between the modes. XeSS often looked too soft and FSR too sharp. With that said, when we move to comparing XeSS performance versus FSR and DLSS balanced modes, again with similar performance, I think XeSS retakes the lead here. The foliage and general shimmering artifacts with FSR are much more noticeable, and while XeSS is also reduced in image quality compared to the balanced mode or DLSS, it's more playable in my opinion. Final scene from the Talos Principle 2 is this scene. When stationary, FSR looks pretty good here, with better image stability than XeSS balanced, which has a few small issues when you look closely. However, as soon as we start moving, I think XeSS has a clear advantage with less shimmering, although this does depend on exactly where you look in the scene. My preference would be to play with XeSS over FSR in this game, even if that meant using the balanced XeSS mode compared to quality of FSR, although in both cases DLSS is the king. Lastly, we get to the worst example for XeSS in terms of performance, which is Assassin's Creed Mirage. Due to the performance of XeSS, the most relevant comparison is the XeSS performance mode versus FSR quality and DLSS quality. I thought this might lead to a horrible experience with XeSS, but that's not quite the case. In this stationary comparison, I thought XeSS performance had notably better fine detail reconstruction, which can be seen in some of the fine ropes in this scene. Not on the level of DLSS, but quite respectable. However, there are some areas that shimmer in the XeSS presentation that don't in the FSR image, so quality is a bit variable. When performing a synchronization, which sweeps the camera around, I also didn't think XeSS looked all that bad when using the performance mode. It's quite difficult to spot any real difference to the FSR image. There is a little less detail at times, but it's hard to notice. It's when walking around the city that I think the limitations of the XeSS performance mode render resolution are the most noticeable. It just doesn't have as much detail as FSR or DLSS. The image is still relatively stable, less so than FSR but not too bad. However, there are areas that don't hold up as well or look a little muddy compared to the higher render resolutions of the other modes. It's really the performance of XeSS that lets it down in this title, because if we use the performance mode for all upscalers, XeSS holds its own quite nicely. You just simply get a lot higher frame rate from the other two solutions, especially FSR on the 7800 XT, so Intel perhaps needs to further optimize XeSS performance in this title. Overall, having looked at the XeSS 1.2 DP4A version across 6 recent games, it's clear that Intel's upscaling technology is in a much better place than it was at launch. XeSS 1.0 was a disaster on Radeon and GeForce graphics cards. It delivered horrible image quality and poor performance, falling well behind what FSR was offering at the time as a broadly compatible upscaling solution. but the improvements made in versions 1.1 and 1.2 have brought about a significant step forward that makes XeSS much more competitive and a truly viable solution for game upscaling. Intel has improved the XeSS DP4A path on two fronts, performance and image quality. Relative to FSR and older versions of XeSS, XeSS 1.2 now runs faster, which at performance parity allows it to run at a higher render resolution than it was able to previously. It's still not as performant as FSR or DLSS, so typically the XeSS balanced mode offers parity with FSR quality, but that's a big step up from previous examples where XeSS performance was the parity point, or at times slower than the highest FSR upscaler option. On top of this, the upgrades to the AI-enhanced upscaling model have substantially improved visual quality. The original version of XeSS had plenty of artifacts even when standing still, like shimmering, flickering, and ghosting. XeSS 1.2 is notably more stable, and while artifacts aren't totally absent, I found fewer game-breaking or highly distracting examples. The technology isn't quite on the level of DLSS yet, but it's much improved, and I would have no issues using XeSS in games. What was most surprising and impressive to me is that XeSS is now delivering superior image quality to FSR in my opinion. This is especially true when comparing at the same render resolution, XeSS quality versus FSR quality, or XeSS performance versus FSR performance, typically has XeSS producing better fine detail, less shimmering, and fewer motion artifacts. I found this to be the case even when compared to the latest version of FSR, currently FSR 2.2. This is a big step forward for the DP4A model, as we knew the Intel exclusive XMX version was capable of pretty good image quality. Even better is the fact that XeSS trades blows or offers superior visual quality to FSR when we account for the performance differences. So when we compare similar performing options like XeSS balanced versus FSR quality, I'd often prefer the XeSS presentation over FSR despite it running at a lower render resolution. In 4 of the 6 games I tested, I would prefer to use XeSS when gaming at 4K on a Radeon GPU. If a game only offered XeSS or FSR, I'd also prefer XeSS on a GeForce GPU, as XeSS runs a little faster there than on Radeon cards, improving things further, although DLSS is still the way to go when available. There's a couple of main takeaways here from this testing. If game developers want to integrate an upscaling solution that is broadly compatible across different graphics cards, then XeSS should now be the priority instead of FSR. In addition to this, it would make sense to integrate DLSS as it offers the best image quality and is compatible with a large portion of GPU owners with Nvidia cards. Depending on the game and level of performance and optimization, FSR might be worth integrating, but it doesn't appear to be a necessary inclusion for time-poor developers that don't have the resources to support 3 upscaling solutions. This puts AMD on the back foot, as previously FSR was the go-to option for broad upscaling support. Without significant improvements to FSR image quality, which Intel has demonstrated is possible as a broad solution, FSR will be destined for last place, and it won't be a necessary or worthwhile inclusion in games. AMD have made some strides recently with FSR 3 frame generation, but the temporal upscaling component is still lacking and has received few improvements over the last year. Intel shouldn't stop here though when it comes to XeSS development. If they can further optimize XeSS DP4A performance so that it performs similarly to FSR at the same render resolution, this would put them further ahead and into a really good position when it comes to features. Intel also needs to develop a frame generation technology to compete with DLSS 3 frame generation and FSR 3 frame generation. If they can do that while maintaining broad GPU compatibility, there would be even less reason for developers to integrate FSR 2 or FSR 3. For now though, it's good to see Intel's continued commitment to improving their GPU ecosystem. We've seen Arc GPU performance come a long way through consistent driver updates, the pricing of Arc GPUs has improved a lot over the last year, and now features like XeSS are in a much nicer position. So good work, Intel. Anyway, that's it for this look at XeSS 1.2 and the comparisons to FSR and DLSS. If you want to support our channel and independent testing, then the best way to do that is via our Patreon or Floatplane accounts. Links to those are in the description below. You'll get access to some cool benefits like our Discord community, monthly live streams, behind the scenes videos, and all sorts of good things. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.